Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. It's been another super hot week here in the UK. I am glad we're on the other end of it, and I'm very glad to be in a slightly air-conditioned room for the week too. But I hope the weather continues to be as nice to look at, I suppose. A note for this week's episode, I am most likely going to embarrass myself with terrible pronunciation throughout this episode, so I'll pre-warn you now that Slavic languages are hard and I've tried my best. But before we start, a big shout out to Joy and her sister, who sent me a lovely Instagram message about a year ago to ask for this monster. So of course, your wish is my command, and we're bringing in the Maid of Pestilence over from Poland to be our guest monster this week. She is known by many names, but we're going to call her the Plague Maiden, or Morowa Dziewica in her native tongue, probably pronounced terribly, and is described as a haunting female spirit in both Polish and Lithuanian folklore. Now, just to start off, a lot of this is Polish folklore. I haven't been able to find a lot of Lithuanian, but it's definitely worth a shout out that this was also within Lithuanian folklore too. She has a couple of descriptions across the board, but one of the most common is that she is a beautiful, tall woman wearing a long white dress or robe, but on closer inspection she is riddled with plague sores, which were festering wounds filled with pus and blood, and were highly infectious. She is also depicted wearing a wreath made of either copper or sometimes even just fire on her head, with dark hair ghostly moving around in the air around her. She is sometimes also depicted as a much older woman who is very haggard and not so beautiful, but it may be that they are one and the same but show different versions to different people. One thing folklorists do agree upon though is that she waves a red handkerchief, which is either dyed intentionally or just red from blood of plague sores. Plague Maidens, which, to avoid the murder of the Polish language, I will be referring to them throughout this episode as, were cursed to show up as an omen of death, but more specifically an omen of the plague and of pestilence, and anyone who saw her would be foretold that the plague would be sweeping through their town, and most likely wiping out a whole load of people. She would indicate which house would be affected by waving her blood-red, plaguey handkerchief into the thresholds of village houses. But it was said that if you were kind to strange women, the Plague Maiden would avoid your house and you and your household would survive. However, in regards to her powers, that's about it. She was said to bring the plague with her wherever she went, making her almost a herald of pestilence that we see in other mythologies and religious stories. Although they would appear in these robes or dresses that would expose some of the rotting flesh, there was nothing really to indicate that they were carrying all of this disease physically, unless you got close enough to see the physical sores. It's also generally debated on whether they control the plague itself, or are just omens of it coming, as there are instances of Plague Maidens sparing those who showed them that kindness in life, or in death when they can see them. It would be a pretty insane power, but it's not really known 100% for sure if they carry, if they bring it, or if they are just the omens that pronounce its arrival. They also typically do not appear as a stereotypical ghost. There's no aura around them, they're not translucent, they're not walk-throughable. The only giveaway is only those intended to see her would see her. It's said that to become a Plague Maiden, you would, funnily enough, need to die of the plague and have some kind of unfinished business. usually something rough and to do with the plague itself, like you were put out of your misery by a kind family member and murdered, or you spread it to your village, or you brought it to your village, for instance. The guilt, the shame, or the disgrace mixed with being a plague victim would generally turn you into this harbinger of disease for others. We don't actually know very much about this monster with the exception of what I've already told you, but we can make some assumptions just as we usually would do to fill in the gaps of monstrosity on this podcast. Of course, they don't eat, they don't reproduce. Their method of reproduction is more women to die of the plague with bad things linked to that death, which was pretty easy back in those days. This monster, though, is textbook European, especially with the stress on the Black Plague itself. But the Morowa Dziewica was Polish and Lithuanian Plague Maidens specifically, and you could find her hanging around plague-destined towns and villages in the Middle Ages. Which is a hint for our origins here, but I'm sure you would have guessed unless you thought I was talking about modern plagues. And a really big important note here is that I am talking about the European Black Death, not just something we would refer to as a plague now, which was used for something like COVID-19, but it was also used for someone spreading something as simple as a cold, or an expression on how much you wanted to avoid someone. But we're creeping too much into etymology and metaphors, so speaking of which, let's talk etymology. I hate to say it, but this one is pretty self-explanatory, and even the Polish word literally means plague maiden. So, it's a woman who comes with the plague, that's about it. What I can tell you though is that they have a couple of other names, such as Maid of Pestilence, Plague Woman and Pester. But, I mean, all of them are also pretty self-explanatory, except Pester, although it kind of is. It's short for pestilence. I don't know how much of this I need to tell you, honestly. It's a nice easy one this week. Anyway, the history of this monster is really easy to get into, and we have a couple of stories that also back this up. But first, we need to launch ourselves back to the Middle Ages when this monster was created, which was between 500 to 1500 AD. But more specifically, we're going to 1347 to 1351 AD, which was when the Black Death was absolutely ravaging Europe. Now, as a pre-warning, this was my favourite subject I ever studied in school, maybe with the exception of Jack the Ripper, so buckle in for some nerd errand time. I really went hard on this one. So, the Black Death is probably one of the most horrific death events in world history, let alone European history. It was otherwise known as the bubonic plague, the pestilence, or the plague on its own, but it was super contagious and super deadly. It affected almost every country in Europe in a time where sanitation was poor and the understanding of disease, infection and contagion was really limited, therefore ended in the deaths of about 30 to 60% of the European population. And I'm talking European as in the continent. That's a huge amount of people. As well as 33% of the Middle East, which we believe it came from originally. It was most likely spread by rat fleas, and because of the poor hygiene in Europe at the time, rats were everywhere. The infection generally started with a fever, achy joints, headaches and vomiting, but would eventually develop into massive buboes, which are pustules in glandular regions, that would burst with infection as well as vomiting blood, limb gangrene and eventual death would follow, within, on average, 8 days. Also, the corpses of plague victims were massively contagious, so they were buried in mass graves known as plague pits, and no matter their religion or belief they were thrown in, and many to this day are still unnamed and also unfound. Sorry for the deep dive, but it's massively interesting, and I honestly wrote most of that from memory too. But from that, you can tell how deadly it was and how widespread, and you can understand how whole households would have been affected, as well as if you had any inkling that plague was coming or you were getting a warning, you would be absolutely terrified. I mean, even without warning, to have the plague around would absolutely scare the bejesus out of you, which is where our Maid of Pestilence comes in. Now, specifically, we're going to talk about Poland. So Poland is a completely landlocked country and is surrounded at this point by plague-infected countries. But actually, it was relatively unscathed during this time, which made it so much worse when they did get 1 or 2 towns hit by the plague, and their fear was massively heightened. We believe it was mostly unaffected because of a lack of trading routes through the country, due to the heavy forested landscape and bad economy, but it wasn't okay for some of Poland's people. The Black Plague in Poland was actually very often blamed on the new Jewish community, because of a large number of Jewish people being forced from country to country, and many of them settling in a welcoming Poland. Because of their migrations, they were blamed as carriers. However, the Jewish community may have also increased Poland's immunity to the plague by introducing hygienics from their religious practices into Polish society. Which is what makes that and our monster so much more interesting. A dark-haired, unfamiliar maiden spreading the plague in a time where dark-haired strangers were believed to be spreading it by fleeing into their country. It's a theory that some folklorists believe connect the Plague Maidens to the migration of Jewish people into Poland at that time, and the stigmatisation of connecting the two together. However, with the great fear of something as fatal as the plague, the existence of them could just be attributed to plain fear of the unknown killer, and a great omen warning them of it, which wasn't uncommon in Polish folklore or European folklore beforehand. We have banshees in Ireland, for example, who did pretty much the same thing. We do have some stories about Plague Maidens though, one of which being that a plague woman turned up to a town she wasn't familiar with and asked for help looking around, but all of the townsfolk turned her away as a stranger or a witch, but one man takes her in and gives her a ride to show her the town. She specifically remembers his house, and when the plague wreaks havoc on the town, his home is completely unaffected, and he and his family survive completely unscathed. Another story is that of Konrad Wellenrod, who was a hero who killed the Plague Maiden with a sword, with Jesus's and the Virgin Mary's names etched into it. He stole the maiden's handkerchief, and whilst the man and his family do die of the plague, the rest of the town survives and is never affected by another plague. Apparently this was a true story, and the handkerchief was kept in a church somewhere, but the location is never told in the poem that this comes from. And actually, I've got a little extract of when they find her, but just as a note that this poem was from much later in 1828, so definitely was not written by someone of the time. On desert plains and churchyards, saith fame, stands visibly the pestilential maid. In white upon her brow a wreath of flame, her brow the trees of Baloise outbraves, and in her hand a blood-stained cloth she waves. The castle guards in terror veil their eyes, the peasant's dog deep burrowing into the ground. Scent death approaching, howl with fearful cries, the maiden's ill-boding step over all is found. Over hamlets, castles and rich towns she goes, oft as she waves the bloody cloth no less, a palace changes to a wilderness, where treads her foot a recent grave upgrows. I think this is a great poem. You can read the whole thing online, you can just search Konrad Wellenrod and you'll be able to read the whole thing. Really suggest it, it's a great poem. But enough of my history lessons. What could this monster actually be? Well, it's a simple one. It's a personification of fear and treated like an omen. However, most likely to have actually been a hallucination or a dream even. You have to put yourself in the mind of a Middle Ages peasant when millions of people around you are sick and dying. It doesn't give comfort to know it's coming, but it's good to know it's coming nonetheless. Of course, there are some big mythical monsters that are like these lovely maidens. I mentioned banshees from Celtic mythology, and they really come to mind with this monster. They are these female spirits that wail around the houses of soon-to-be deceased people. But as well as this, another one that shouts at me is the Horseman of Pestilence from biblical mythology, a rider who spreads disease and infection and was blamed for the Black Death by religious people who thought this may have meant the end times, and to be honest, they weren't far off. I know I said 30 to 60% of European people died, but just to put that in numbers, that's 70 to 200 million people died of the Black Death, which is more than the population of the UK, France, Germany and Spain put together in its highest peak. It was truly devastating for Europe, so totally would have also thought it was the apocalypse too. I would have been there hailing that Mary. But now on to modern media, which we only really have one piece of media for, and that's the Witcher games, which have starred Plague Maidens under the name Pester, but otherwise I filled this in with pestilence carriers, which I think embodies her and this trope close enough. For art, have a look at Plague Maiden, another Polish myth by Giovanni Thim, as well as the Pester cards from the Witcher Gwent card game. The art is really beautiful in both of these, but otherwise stick with independent stuff for this one. I promise you won't be disappointed, but you may be creeped out. They have taken an interpretation and gone wild with it in terms of rotting and gross skeletal stuff. In movies, we have Miss Mend, Panic in the Streets, Anazapta, Black Death, Isle of the Dead, The Seventh Seal, The Last Duel, Lady Snowblood 2, Love Song of Vengeance, and Season of the Witch. For TV, we have True Blood, Ghosts, Mystery Hunters, Brimstone, Gotham, Babylon 5, Supernatural, Body of Proof, Courage the Cowardly Dog, Skeleton Warriors, Family Guy, Inhumanoids, Stargate SG-1, Codename Kids Next Door, Spiral Zone, Captain Planet and the Planeteers, JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, One Piece, and Yu-Gi-Oh! In video games, we have ones such as The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, where you can actively interact with a pester, Medieval 2 Total War, A Plague Tale Innocence, Vampire, Plague Inc., Crusader Kings, Borderlands 2, Elder Scrolls, Dark Souls, Diablo, League of Legends, Stellaris, Prototype, Heroes of the Storm, Guild Wars 2, Goose Goose Duck, For Honor, EverQuest, Grim Dawn, Touhou Project, Warcraft 3, World of Warcraft, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, Town of Salem, Warlords Battlecry 3, Tears to Tiara 2, Dota 2, Battleborn, Trauma Center Atlas, and Dragon Age. My book recommendation this week was also recommended to me by Joy, who suggested this monster, which was For Polish Folklore and Myth by Joan Lifrig-Zug-Boré and Alice Wadowski-Buck. Or you can have a look at The Slavic Myths by Noah Charney and Svetlana Slapsak for some really great Polish myths and legends in both of these recommendations. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? I mean, probably no. I actually would say it's more plausible because it's a ghost. If it wasn't, I'd be a solid no, because I generally think this was most likely a scapegoat for someone bringing in the plague. What I mean with that is, someone brings in the plague, starts coincidentally seeing symptoms, and then says they saw a ghostly maiden predicting it or even bring it in herself, when they know that they brought the plague in. I really love this monster though. I love the idea of her, and I think that's because I really enjoy the idea of someone wielding pestilence as a monster or as a great villain, which was always my favourite horseman. Pestilence has always been my favourite, and I've always kind of been drawn to that one. I also will say that I play an Affliction Warlock in World of Warcraft, so I do like the whole disease and power thing in my nerdy life too. And actually, if you're interested in plagues, World of Warcraft had a plague once, and it was massively viral in terms of not only in the game, it was an actual virus in the game, but it was also viral in real life. Everyone was talking about it back in 2002. I highly recommend looking into it because it was really massive that they even studied it during COVID to look at transmission effects. Honestly, have a research into a deep dive into the World of Warcraft plague. I really, really recommend it if you're into video games and you're at all interested in virology. I also really loved studying disease as I grew up, but definitely something as interesting as the Black Death, which is so massive in European history. It's one of those historical events that all Europeans can relate to, but also a lot of our cultural and societal impact from that affects all of us. So it's something we all kind of sit with together in our world history. I also think these look pretty cool, and there's an awesome version of the pestilence made in The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. You don't just interact with one during this, there's a whole quest line involving one, where you can talk to her, you can also help her, you can kill her. They're really scary to look at, but so unbelievably cool from a video game perspective. So I recommend you check that out, and The Witcher in general if you're into Polish myth monsters. It is based off of Polish folklore, and to be honest, I should have added The Witcher to my recommended books list this week because they do a whole load of Polish mythology in them. But what do you think? Did the Plague Maidens spread or predict the plague across Europe? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. A super cool monster this week, and one I could proper geek out on, so thank you for bearing with me for that. And another really big thank you to Joy and her sister for sending this over. I really hope I've done her justice for you, and I really love doing suggested monsters, so if you've got one you want to hear about, reach out to me. This just shows that I do them. It may take me a while, but I do them. Next week though, we're heading on over to Japan, to one of the coldest parts, to play host to a frozen spirit. Don't let the Yukai Honor hug you next Thursday, or you'll freeze to death in an instant, so join me then. For now though, thank you so much for listening, it's been an absolute pleasure as always. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. And you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals, they might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.